Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey back in time, not to mighty battles or grand castles, but right into the very kitchens and dining halls of the Middle Ages. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. You're walking through a smoky, bustling medieval town. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something that smells vaguely of stale cabbage and unidentifiable meat. You pass by a grimy store where a vendor is hawking what looks suspiciously like a blackened, lumpy sausage. You feel a sudden pang of hunger and then a wave of nausea because you quickly realize that your modern, discerning palate and, likely your stomach probably, won't survive this trip. Seriously, what these folks considered a good meal might make your digestive system stage a full-scale revolt. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always wild to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in a rather cramped, dark dwelling, typical of a medieval peasant's home. The air is damp, and the only light comes from a small, sputtering fire in the hearth. The smell, you've quickly learnt, is a constant companion. What immediately strikes you if you were to peer into the humble larder is the sheer, overwhelming presence of grain. It's everywhere, sacks of it, sheaves of it, and the ever-present, sometimes slightly mouldy, loaves of bread. You see, for the vast majority of medieval society, especially the serfs and common folk, bread wasn't just part of the meal. It was the meal. It was the backbone, the filler, the utensil, and sometimes the only thing standing between you and gnawing hunger. Imagine your daily life revolving around the harvest. From dawn till dusk, you're toiling in the fields, your hands calloused, your back aching. And what fuels this relentless labor? Most likely, it's a coarse, dark loaf of bread, probably made from rye or barley, perhaps mixed with a bit of oats. This isn't your artisanal sourdough or fluffy white sliced bread. Oh no, this is heavy, dense, and often quite tough. It's designed to fill you up and stay with you, providing the slow release energy needed for a day of back-breaking work. It's often baked in communal ovens, a social ritual in itself where everyone brings their dough and waits for their turn. This shared baking process was a huge part of community life, a place where gossip was exchanged and friendships forged, all centered around the creation of this vital foodstuff. One of the more fascinating, and frankly a bit disturbing, quirks of medieval bread was its occasional role beyond mere sustenance. You might find yourself eating a trencher. No, not a trench of bread, but a trencher, which was literally a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate. You'd pile your meager stew or vegetables onto it, letting the bread soak up the juices, and then, when you were done, you'd either eat the soggy trencher or, more often, give it to your dog or the poor. Talk about zero waste. It's an ingenious, if not entirely appetizing, solution to the lack of proper dinnerware. And historians still argue whether the primary reason for trenchers was truly economic saving on potteria, if it was a deliberate culinary choice to enhance the meal's flavors. The sheer volume of grain consumed was staggering. An average medieval person might consume several pounds of bread a day. Think about that for a second. That's a lot of carbs, even for someone doing intense manual labor. And while wheat was preferred, especially for the more affluent, it was often too expensive for the common person. So rye, barley, and oats became the staples, sometimes mixed with legumes like peas or beans to stretch the flour further. The quality of your bread was often a direct indicator of your social standing. The finer, whiter bread made from sifted wheat flour was reserved for the nobility and the clergy, a symbol of their elevated status. Your bread, my friend, is probably a dark, hearty, and somewhat gritty affair, full of bran and whatever other bits snuck in during the milling process. You might even find the occasional pebble or insect, adding an unexpected crunch. Just a little extra protein, right? This focus on grain meant that agricultural failures, like a bad harvest, were utterly catastrophic. Without the grain, there was no bread, and without bread, there was widespread famine. You can imagine the constant anxiety that must have permeated medieval life, knowing that your very survival hinged on the whims of the weather and the fertility of the land. It made every harvest a moment of profound relief. a temporary reprieve from the ever-present threat of starvation. And yet, despite the simplicity, this reliance on bread fostered a deep connection to the land and the cycles of nature, a connection we've largely lost in our modern world of endless supermarket aisles. As your journey through time continues, shifting from the medieval peasant's humble kitchen, you suddenly find yourself stepping into an entirely different realm, the world of medieval royalty. Forget idyllic storybook images. The birth and early childhood of a royal heir in the Middle Ages was often a precarious, public, and surprisingly unglamorous affair. You'd quickly realize that despite all the pomp, survival was far from guaranteed. Imagine the scene of a royal birth. This wasn't a private affair in a sterile hospital room. Oh no, a queen's lying in was a highly public event, often attended by numerous nobles, church officials, and even commoners, all gathered to witness the birth and confirm the legitimacy of the heir. Picture the queen, perhaps draped in rich fabrics, but still in considerable discomfort, surrounded by a crowd of onlookers in a chilly, drafty chamber. This public spectacle served a vital political purpose: to prevent any doubt about the royal lineage and ensure a smooth succession. It sounds rather intrusive, doesn't it? Like a live broadcast of a very personal moment, but without the benefit of modern medicine or privacy. The immediate aftermath of a royal birth was equally far from cozy. The newborn royal would be whisked away from the mother, often to be raised in a separate nursery or even a different castle, usually under the care of a wet nurse. This practice wasn't due to a lack of maternal affection, but rather a combination of social custom, perceived health benefits. Wet nurses were thought to be healthier than noble mothers, who often had poorer diets, and practical necessity. The Queen's primary duty was to produce heirs, and then to resume her political and social roles. Imagine being a royal infant, barely minutes old, and already separated from your birth mother. A mainstream historical fact is the incredibly high infant and child mortality rates during the medieval period, even for royalty. Despite their wealth and access to the best available care, many royal children did not survive infancy or early childhood due to disease, infection, or accident. This constant threat of death hung heavy over every royal nursery, making each surviving child a precious commodity and a source of both hope and anxiety for the dynasty. Every royal child was an investment, and the loss of one could have significant political ramifications. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about royal infancy, the practice of swaddling. Royal infants, like most medieval babies, would be tightly wrapped in long strips of linen or wool, known as swaddling bands, from head to toe. This was believed to keep the baby warm, prevent limb deformities, and encourage straight growth. Imagine being unable to move your arms or legs, completely restricted for most of your early life. It sounds rather uncomfortable, doesn't it? More like a tiny human burrito than a freely wriggling infant. Historians still argue whether swaddling genuinely offered physical benefits or if its primary purpose was simply to keep infants contained and easier for caregivers to manage in a world without cribs or playpens. As the royal child grew out of infancy, their childhood was far from carefree. They would be surrounded by a vast household of attendants, tutors, and playmates, often children of lesser nobility, but their lives were meticulously structured and rarely private. Play was often seen as preparation for future duties. Boys would engage in mock battles and learn to ride, while girls would be instructed in household management, embroidery, and courtly graces. You'd find yourself constantly observed, every action scrutinized. Your food would be tasted for poison, your activities overseen, and your interactions limited to those deemed appropriate for your station. The innocence of childhood, as we understand it, was a luxury rarely afforded to those destined for the throne. Your emotional development might have been secondary to your training as a future ruler. So, from the moment of a public birth to a carefully controlled upbringing, the early life of medieval royalty was a stark contrast to a modern childhood. It was a life steeped in duty, danger, and the ever-present awareness of your dynastic importance. And for all the gilded surroundings, you might find yourself longing for the simple freedom and privacy of an ordinary upbringing. Stepping out of the closely observed and fragile world of royal infancy, your journey through the medieval court now brings you to the demanding realm of royal education and training. Forget casual schooling or choosing your own subjects. A medieval royal's upbringing was a rigorous, practical, and highly specialized curriculum designed with one overarching goal: to prepare them to rule. And, frankly, it sounds exhausting. Imagine your day as a young prince or princess. From an incredibly early age, perhaps as young as 7, your formal education would begin. For boys, the emphasis was heavily on martial skills and leadership. You'd be taught to ride from a tender age, spending hours in the saddle, learning horsemanship that was essential for warfare and travel. Then came weapon training: the sword, the lance, the bow. This wasn't just for show, it was survival. A king was expected to lead his armies into battle, to be a competent warrior, and to defend his realm. You'd practice endlessly, your small hands growing accustomed to the weight of a blade, your body developing the strength needed for a knight's heavy armor. Just imagine the bruises. Beyond the physical, there was a strong focus on strategy and tactics, often learned through games, hunting, and observing older knights. You'd be taught the art of falconry and hunting, not just as pastimes, but as ways to develop patience, precision, and an understanding of the land. These skills were considered crucial for managing a kingdom and its resources. For girls, the education was equally rigorous, though focused on different disciplines. A princess would be tutored in household management, learning how to run a vast castle with hundreds of staff, from managing supplies to overseeing banquets. She would learn languages, particularly Latin and often French, essential for diplomacy and understanding religious texts. Needlework, music, and dance were also part of the curriculum, considered essential for courtly graces and for presenting a cultured image to foreign dignitaries. More importantly, she would be educated in the intricate art of diplomacy and alliance building, knowing that her future likely involved a politically advantageous marriage. A mainstream historical fact is the importance of literacy and Latin in royal education. While widespread literacy was uncommon, medieval monarchs and their children were typically highly educated for their time, especially in Latin, the language of the church, law, and international diplomacy. Access to illuminated manuscripts and tutors meant they could read, write, and understand complex theological and administrative texts, a critical skill for governance. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit, the role of the whipping boy. For some medieval princes, particularly in later periods, a whipping boy was a young noble boy who would receive physical punishment in place of the prince when the prince misbehaved. This was based on the belief that a prince was too exalted to be beaten, but that someone else could receive the punishment as a proxy. Imagine being this poor kid, getting disciplined for someone else's mischief. It speaks volumes about the peculiar ways medieval society dealt with royal discipline and privilege. Historians still argue whether whipping boys were truly a widespread formal institution or a more sporadic practice based on individual tutors and princely dispositions. Beyond formal lessons, observation and apprenticeship were key. A young royal would spend considerable time observing their parents, attending court sessions, watching legal proceedings, and sitting in on council meetings. They would learn by doing, by listening, and by immersing themselves in the practicalities of governance and court life. There was no gap year or leisurely exploration of personal interests. Your destiny was clear, and your training was relentless. The environment itself was a constant teacher. Life in a medieval castle, with its constant flow of people, its political intrigues, and its ceremonial demands, provided a practical education in leadership and human nature. You'd learn to discern loyalty, to command respect, and to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics from a very young age. So, as you imagine yourself enduring endless hours of sword practice or meticulously embroidering a tapestry, all while being groomed for a life of immense responsibility, you realize that medieval royal childhood, for all its privilege, was fundamentally a rigorous training program. It was a life shaped by duty, not by personal choice, preparing you for a throne that could be both a burden and a blessing. Leaving the rigorous training grounds of royal education, your journey now brings you to what was perhaps the most public and overtly lavish aspect of medieval royal life: food and feasting rituals. Forget your quiet family dinners. A royal meal was a meticulously choreographed performance, a display of power, wealth, and abundance that would make even the grandest modern banquet seem understated. You'd quickly discover that eating was as much a political act as it was a means of sustenance. Imagine entering the great hall of a medieval castle during a royal feast. The sheer scale is breathtaking. Long, heavy tables groan under the weight of countless dishes, surrounded by hundreds of guests ranging from high-ranking nobles to visiting dignitaries, all arranged according to their precise social standing. The air is thick with the rich aromas of roasted meats, exotic spices, and fine wines. Torches flicker on the walls, casting dancing shadows, and the hall buzzes with the murmur of conversation, punctuated by the sounds of musicians, jesters, and servants scurrying to and fro. At the very head of the hall, on a raised dais, sits the royal table, often adorned with the finest linen, gold, and silver plate, and elaborate centerpieces. The king and queen would sit here, often with only the most esteemed guests or closest family members. This elevated position wasn't just for comfort, it was a clear visual declaration of their supreme authority, allowing them to survey their entire court. Every glance, every gesture from the royal table held significance. The food itself was a spectacle. Roasted whole animals, swans, peacocks, boars would be brought in, often redressed in their own feathers or adorned with gilded decorations, as we discussed previously with medieval noble dining. These subtleties were less about consumption and more about demonstrating the immense resources and culinary artistry at the monarch's command. There would be multiple courses, each featuring a vast array of meats, fish, rich stews, spiced puddings, and intricate pastries. Imagine the sheer volume of food designed to overwhelm and impress, often far more than could possibly be eaten. A mainstream historical fact is the practice of first service and second service. At major feasts, dishes would be presented in distinct services, often with a grand procession for each. The first service might include lighter fare and appetizers, while the second would feature the main roasted meats and more substantial dishes. This structured presentation added to the ceremonial nature of the meal, making it a prolonged event lasting for hours, often interspersed with entertainment. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about royal dining, the role of the royal taster. Given the constant threat of assassination and poisoning in the medieval period, particularly for monarchs, a designated taster was employed. This trusted servant would sample every dish and drink before it was presented to the royal person, ensuring it was safe for consumption. Imagine having a job where every single mouthful could literally be your last. It's a grim reminder of the ever-present paranoia that could pervade even the most lavish of feasts. Historians still argue whether the taster's role was primarily a practical security measure or if it also served as a visible symbol of the monarch's constant vulnerability and supreme importance. Etiquette at the royal table was incredibly strict. Forks, as you might recall, were still rare, so fingers, knives, and spoons were the primary tools. However, there were elaborate rules about how to use them, where to place your hands, how to share a trencher, and how to drink from a communal cup, if such was offered to less distinguished guests. Overindulgence, while common, was still tempered by the need to maintain decorum. After all, you were constantly being observed. Entertainment was an integral part of the feasting ritual. Minstrels would play music, jesters would perform antics, and acrobats, or even mummers, actors, might entertain the guests between courses. This wasn't just a meal, it was a sensory spectacle designed to elevate the experience and cement the monarch's image as a generous and powerful host. So, as you watch the pageantry unfold, the endless dishes, the constant stream of entertainment, and the meticulous adherence to ritual, you understand that a medieval royal feast was far more than just a dinner. It was a carefully constructed display of power, a political tool, and a constant reaffirmation of the monarch's divine right to rule. And despite the incredible array of food, you might find yourself a little overwhelmed by the sheer formality of it all. From the overflowing tables of the royal feast, your gaze now shifts to the very individuals at the center of all this spectacle. The medieval king and queen draped in their elaborate attire. Your next lesson in royal life brings you to the fascinating, often restrictive, and surprisingly uncomfortable world of royal fashion and dress. Forget comfort or personal preference. Every stitch, every jewel, and every layer of clothing was a deliberate statement of power, status, and divine right. Imagine yourself as a medieval monarch getting dressed for the day. This wasn't a quick hop into a casual outfit. It was a lengthy, intricate ritual, often requiring numerous attendants. You'd start with layers of fine linen undergarments, chosen for their softness against the skin, but also for absorption, given the lack of frequent bathing. Then came the hose, tights, and perhaps a tunic. For men, the outer garments would include elaborate doublets, long tunics, or cloaks, often made from heavy silks, velvets, or brocades, imported from distant lands. These fabrics were incredibly expensive, dyed with vibrant deep colors like royal blue, often achieved with costly woad or indigo, rich crimson or imperial purple, derived from rare shellfish. For women, the layers were even more complex. A kirtle, an underdress, would be followed by a gown, often with voluminous skirts, long trailing sleeves, and elaborate neckline. These gowns could be incredibly heavy, restrictive, and designed to create a majestic, almost unapproachable silhouette. Imagine trying to walk gracefully with yards of heavy fabric trailing behind you, constantly worrying about tripping or snagging your elaborate attire. A mainstream historical fact about royal fashion is the strict enforcement of sumptuary laws. These laws, common throughout the medieval period, dictated what fabrics, colors, and types of clothing different social classes were permitted to wear. Only royalty and the highest nobility were allowed to wear certain furs, like ermine and sable, certain rich colors, or specific luxury fabrics. These laws weren't just about controlling spending. They were a clear visual code, ensuring that one's social status was immediately identifiable from their clothing. To dress above your station was not just bad manners, it was illegal. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about royal accessories. The use of massive, elaborate crowns. While crowns today are often symbolic and worn for brief ceremonial occasions, medieval crowns could be incredibly large, heavy, and encrusted with numerous precious jewels. Imagine balancing a literal weight of gold and gems on your head for hours during a formal procession or a court session. It wasn't just decorative, it was a physical burden, a constant reminder of the heavy responsibilities of kingship. You'd likely feel a permanent crick in your neck. Historians still argue whether the extreme weight and size of some medieval crowns were primarily a display of immense wealth, a symbolic representation of the burden of rule, or simply an aesthetic preference of the era. Beyond the main garments, accessories were vital. Belts, often jeweled, would hold purses or daggers. Gloves, embroidered and perfumed, were a sign of refinement. For women, elaborate headwear, from simple veils to towering hennons, completed the look. Every detail was carefully considered and crafted to enhance the royal image. The sheer impracticality of some royal clothing, particularly for active monarchs, often meant a separate wardrobe for hunting, riding, or, God forbid, going to war. But for formal occasions, movement was secondary to majesty. The fabrics, while beautiful, would be difficult to clean, relying on airing and spot cleaning rather than frequent washing, which also speaks to the different standards of hygiene. So, as you stand, or perhaps carefully sit, lest you crush your finery in the imagined weight and splendor of medieval royal dress, you realize that clothing was a carefully constructed facade. It was designed to project power, command respect, and visually reinforce the divine right to rule, often at the expense of personal comfort. You'd probably find yourself longing for the simple freedom of a t-shirt and sweatpants after just an hour in those elaborate layers. Having experienced the stiff grandeur of royal fashion, your journey through medieval royal life now leads you into a less discussed and often rather pungent aspect: royal hygiene and personal care. Forget pristine porcelain and daily showers. The medieval approach to cleanliness, even for kings and queens, was far removed from modern standards, relying on different customs and a surprising tolerance for odors. You'll quickly discover that being royalty didn't necessarily mean being sparkling clean. Imagine starting your day as a monarch. While bathing was certainly known, it was not a daily ritual. A full bath, often in a large wooden tub, brought into your chamber and filled with heated water by servants, was a rare luxury, perhaps once a week, or even less frequently, depending on the season and the availability of resources. The water would be heated in cauldrons over a fire, then painstakingly carried to your room. This wasn't about leisure, it was a substantial logistical undertaking. Daily washes would be more akin to a quick sponge bath, usually involving a basin of cold water and a linen cloth. You'd focus on exposed areas like hands and face. The rest of your body might go unwashed for days or even weeks. And forget about modern soap. While rudimentary soaps existed, they weren't used with the same frequency or efficacy. Imagine the pervasive, subtle scent of unwashed bodies, compounded by heavy fabrics and perhaps lingering perfume. A mainstream historical fact is the reliance on linen undergarments for personal cleanliness. Because outer garments were difficult to clean and worn for long periods, linen shirts and shifts were worn directly against the skin. These could be changed daily for the wealthy and washed, drawing sweat and grime away from the body and protecting the more expensive outer clothing. This frequent change of underlinen was considered the primary form of personal hygiene for many, rather than full-body bathing. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about royal hygiene: the use of herbal strewing mixtures on floors. To combat the pervasive odors from unwashed bodies, animals, and general waste, castle floors, even in royal chambers, were often covered with fresh rushes, herbs like lavender, mint, and chamomile, and sometimes even flowers. Imagine walking through a layer of fragrant vegetation, which would mask unpleasant smells and add a subtle perfume to the air. However, these rushes and herbs were not changed daily and could become a breeding ground for fleas and vermin as they decomposed. It was a pleasant smell, perhaps, but a surprisingly unsanitary practice. Historians still argue whether these strewing herbs were primarily for aesthetic appeal, odor control, or had a perceived, albeit unscientific, medicinal benefit. Dental hygiene was rudimentary at best. You might chew on fresh herbs to freshen your breath, or rub your teeth with a rough cloth. Tooth decay and gum disease were widespread, even among royalty, often leading to painful extractions without anesthetic. Imagine the constant ache of a bad tooth, with no easy relief. Hair care was also different. While royalty would have their hair brushed and styled, washing, it was infrequent. Wigs and hairpieces were sometimes used, especially for women, and these would also require meticulous cleaning and care. Perfumes and pomades were common not just for fragrance, but also to mask less pleasant odors. The concept of personal space and privacy was also different. You'd be attended by numerous servants throughout your daily routine. Even for intimate tasks, there was little expectation of being truly alone or secluded. This constant presence of others meant that your personal habits, hygienic or otherwise, were often observed and assisted. So, as you try to imagine living with less frequent baths, rudimentary tooth care, and the pervasive background hum of lingering body and animal scents, you begin to appreciate the silent revolutions in modern hygiene. The cleanliness of a Victorian house, which we just explored, was a significant leap from medieval royal standards, reminding you that even a crown couldn't guarantee a truly fresh feeling. You'd definitely be reaching for the nearest bar of soap. Emerging from the subtle discomforts of medieval royal hygiene, your journey now brings you to a far more immediate and existential concern for monarchs: health, illness, and medicine. Forget your advanced diagnostics, antibiotics, and sterile operating rooms. Illness in the medieval court was a constant, unpredictable, and often deadly companion, and royal medical treatments could be as terrifying as the diseases themselves. You'd quickly realize that being a king or queen offered little protection from the grim realities of medieval ailment. Imagine the pervasive presence of disease. The medieval world was rife with infectious illnesses that could sweep through a court with terrifying speed. Measles, smallpox, dysentery, and of course the ever-present threat of the Black Death could fell a monarch as easily as a peasant. Royal courts, with their constant influx of people from different regions and often questionable sanitation, were ripe breeding grounds for contagions. You'd live with a constant, underlying anxiety about falling ill, knowing that even a common cold could escalate into something fatal. When illness struck a royal person, the ensuing medical attention was a bizarre blend of practical remedies, superstition, and rudimentary science. Physicians, often trained at universities, would rely on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to be caused by an imbalance of these humours, and treatments aimed to restore that balance. This meant common practices like bloodletting, cutting a vein, or applying leeches to remove excess blood, or purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea with strong laxatives to expel bad humours. Imagine feeling weak and ill, only to have your doctor bleed you further or give you a concoction that makes you violently sick. It often made the patient worse, not better. A mainstream historical fact is the incredibly high mortality rate, even for monarchs, often due to seemingly minor infections or common illnesses. For example, King Edward VI of England, though later than peak medieval, illustrating the point, died from what was likely tuberculosis at the age of 15. Countless medieval kings and queens succumbed to fevers, dysentery, or infected wounds. This underscores the brutal reality that wealth and status offered little immunity from the pervasive microbial world. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about royal remedies: the use of precious gems and unicorn horn. Beyond bloodletting, royal physicians might prescribe remedies that sound utterly fantastical to us. Powdered precious stones like sapphires or emeralds were believed to have medicinal properties and were sometimes mixed into drinks. More famously, ground unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, was highly prized as a universal antidote to poison and a cure for many ailments. Imagine swallowing ground up jewels or tusk powder, believing it held curative powers. It speaks to the blend of scientific ignorance and desperate hope that characterized medieval medicine. Historians still argue whether the belief in these magical remedies was purely superstitious, or if it also served as a psychological placebo for desperate patients and their families. Beyond physicians, medieval courts might also employ apothecaries, who prepared herbal remedies and drugs, barber surgeons, who performed minor surgeries, bloodletting, and tooth extractions, and wise women or folk healers, especially for the poor, but sometimes consulted by the desperate wealthy. The constant presence of various illnesses meant that the royal household would always have a cadre of medical professionals on hand, even if their methods were dubious. The general environment of the castle also contributed to health challenges. Drafty halls, damp conditions, and poor sanitation within the castle walls fostered environments where disease could thrive. Despite the wealth, proper ventilation and waste disposal, as we understand them, were largely absent. So, as you feel a phantom ache or a subtle chill, you realize that the crown offered little protection from the grim reaper in the Middle Ages. You'd live with a constant awareness of your own fragility, relying on a medical system that was often more harmful than helpful. The thought of a modern hospital, with its sterile environment and effective treatments, would feel like a miraculous dream. Leaving the precarious world of medieval royal health, your journey through the life of a monarch now takes you beyond the castle walls and onto the open road. The often arduous yet entirely necessary activity of travel and royal progresses. Forget comfortable first-class flights or smooth air-conditioned car rides. Medieval royal travel was a monumental undertaking, fraught with discomfort, danger, and endless logistical challenge. You'd quickly discover that ruling a kingdom meant constantly being on the move. Imagine preparing for a royal progress. This wasn't just the king or queen and a few attendants. Oh no, a royal progress involved hundreds, sometimes even thousands of people. Courtiers, household staff, cooks, servants, guards, chaplains, musicians, scribes, and vast quantities of baggage. Picture an entire mobile court stretching for miles along unpaved, muddy roads. It was less a journey and more a slow-moving invasion. The sheer logistics of moving such a large retinue, feeding them, housing them, and protecting them were immense. The purpose of these progresses was multifaceted. Monarchs didn't have permanent capital cities or instantaneous communication. To exert their authority, collect taxes, administer justice, and maintain loyalty, they had to physically travel throughout their realm, showing their face to their subjects and meeting with local nobles. It was a vital act of governance, a public display of power, and a way to consume local resources without exhausting any single region. Imagine having to literally show up to remind people you're in charge. A mainstream historical fact is that royal progresses were crucial for governance. They allowed the monarch to hear petitions, settle disputes, inspect castles and lands, and ensure the loyalty of their vassals. Without regular progresses, a king's authority could easily diminish in distant parts of his kingdom. It was a physical manifestation of power, essential for maintaining control over a diverse and often rebellious realm. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about royal travel comfort, or lack thereof, the state of medieval roads. For the most part, roads were little more than dirt tracks, often muddy in wet weather, dusty and dry, and riddled with potholes and ruts. Travel was slow and incredibly uncomfortable. Carriages, though increasingly elaborate for royalty, lacked modern suspension, meaning every bump and jolt was felt keenly. Imagine bouncing and swaying for hours on end, covered in dust or mud, with no smooth tarmac in sight. It makes you long for even the bumpiest modern bus ride. Historians still argue whether the slow pace of royal progresses was primarily due to the poor condition of roads, the immense size of the royal retinue, or a deliberate choice to allow time for local engagements and displays of power. Accommodation along the way was another challenge. While kings and queens might stay in their own castles or those of loyal nobles, these buildings often lacked the capacity to house such a massive retinue comfortably. Many courtiers and staff would have to sleep in tents, in barns, or even outdoors. Supplies, including food and fodder for horses, had to be either transported with the progress or sourced from the local area, placing a significant burden on the communities they visited. Danger was also a constant companion. Roads could be infested with bandits, rival nobles might attempt an ambush, and even accidents like a carriage wheel breaking could leave the royal party stranded. Guards and knights formed the vanguard and rearguard, constantly vigilant. Illness, as you recall, was also a threat, and a monarch falling sick on progress could throw the entire kingdom into turmoil. So, as you imagine yourself jolting along a rough track, surrounded by a dusty, sprawling caravan, enduring uncomfortable lodging and constant vigilance, you realize that medieval royal travel was a testament to endurance and necessity. It was a far cry from a luxurious vacation. It was the demanding physical reality of ruling a vast, often unruly medieval kingdom. You'd certainly appreciate your reclining airplane seat after this. Leaving the dusty, arduous tracks of royal progresses, your journey through the life of a medieval monarch now leads you to perhaps its most iconic and physically demanding aspect: warfare and knightly duties. Forget cinematic battles with clear lines and heroic charges. For a medieval king, warfare was a brutal, personal, and ever-present reality, demanding rigorous training and often direct participation on the battlefield. You'd quickly realize that wearing a crown often meant wielding a sword. Imagine being a young prince, raised not just in manners and diplomacy, but forged into a warrior. From an early age, your training would focus on the skills essential for medieval combat. You would spend countless hours on horseback, mastering the art of riding in heavy armor, a skill far more complex than simply sitting on a horse. Then came the weapons: the longsword, heavy and unforgiving; the lance, unwieldy and powerful; the mace, designed for brutal impact. You'd practice endlessly in the tilting yard, perfecting your aim and strength, your body conditioned to the immense physical demands of medieval combat. A king was expected to lead his armies. This wasn't merely a symbolic role. Monarchs often personally commanded their troops in battle, fighting alongside their knights. Picture the chaos of a medieval battlefield: the deafening clash of steel, the shouts of men, the thud of arrows, the screams of the wounded. Dressed in heavy armor, perhaps weighing 50-70 pounds, you'd be attempting to maneuver, fight, and direct your troops, all while facing the very real threat of injury, capture, or death. Just imagine trying to sprint, let alone fight, in that kind of gear. A mainstream historical fact is the personal leadership of medieval kings in battle. From William the Conqueror at Hastings to Richard I leading Crusader armies, direct royal participation was often expected and seen as a crucial aspect of their legitimacy and courage. A king who led from the front inspired his men, but also put his life and the future of his dynasty directly on the line. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about knightly duties, the tournament as a form of training and entertainment. Tournaments, while spectacles, were not just for show. They were vital training grounds for medieval knights and royalty. They involved real combat, albeit often with blunted weapons, testing skills in jousting, melees, mock battles, and individual duels. Injuries, sometimes fatal, were common. Imagine competing in a full-contact sport where a misstep could mean a broken bone or worse, all for honor and practice. It was an extreme form of professional development. Historians still argue whether tournaments primarily served as military training, a means for knights to gain wealth and reputation, or simply as a highly regulated form of violent entertainment for the masses. Beyond direct combat, knightly duties included the defense of castles, siege warfare, and policing their land. A king might spend weeks or months besieging a rebellious stronghold, enduring the harsh conditions of a military camp. They were expected to be strategists, tacticians, and hardened leaders, capable of making life or death decisions on the fly. The physical toll of this life was immense. Injuries, both minor and severe, were common and often led to chronic pain or disabilities in later life, as medical care was rudimentary. Yet, the expectation remained. A king had to be strong, resilient, and prepared to fight for his kingdom. His very legitimacy often rested on his martial prowess and his willingness to face danger alongside his men. So, as you imagine yourself encased in shining heavy armor, gripping a sweat-slicked sword, standing on a muddy battlefield, you understand that the glamour of medieval royalty came with a very sharp, very heavy edge. It was a life where the king was truly the chief warrior, and your survival and the fate of your kingdom could well depend on your ability to wield a blade. You'd certainly appreciate a desk job after a day of medieval combat training. Having imagined the clatter and mud of the medieval battlefield, your journey through the life of a monarch now shifts to a realm where diplomacy often trumps steel, marriage, and alliances. Forget romantic notions of true love. For medieval royalty, marriage was almost exclusively a political tool, a strategic alliance forged to consolidate power, secure borders, and ensure the continuation of a dynasty. You'd quickly realize that your personal feelings were largely irrelevant when it came to choosing a spouse. Imagine being a young prince or princess, perhaps barely in your teens. Your future spouse would almost certainly be chosen for you, often from a powerful foreign noble house or a rival kingdom. The negotiations would be lengthy and complex, involving ambassadors, lawyers, and extensive charters detailing dowries, inheritances, and reciprocal military aid. Picture your parents or their representatives poring over maps and genealogies, weighing the political advantages of one union against another. Your personal appearance, temperament, or even your language might be secondary to the strategic benefit of uniting two powerful families or nations. These royal marriages were designed to create strong bonds between kingdoms, bringing peace, trade agreements, and mutual defense pacts. A strategic marriage could end a long-standing war, secure a disputed territory, or provide crucial allies against a common enemy. The queen, as a foreign princess, often became a living bridge between her birth country and her new home, expected to foster good relations and sometimes even act as a de facto ambassador. A mainstream historical fact is the concept of dynastic marriage as a cornerstone of medieval European politics. Royal houses across the continent were intricately linked by generations of intermarriage, creating a vast, complex web of kinship and alliance. This meant that wars often involved cousins fighting cousins, and peace was frequently brokered through the union of young, often unwilling royal children. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about the realities of royal marriage, the bedding ceremony. To publicly confirm the consummation of a royal marriage and thus the legitimacy of any future heirs, a public bedding ceremony often took place. After the wedding feast, the newly married royal couple would be led to their bedchamber by nobles and clergy, who would then witness them getting into bed, offering blessings and sometimes even bawdy jokes. Imagine the pressure and utter lack of privacy on your wedding night. It was a highly ritualized, incredibly awkward, yet politically crucial event. Historians still argue whether the bedding ceremony was primarily a symbolic act for dynastic legitimacy, a form of public celebration, or a lingering pagan ritual absorbed into Christian customs. The personal sacrifice involved in these marriages was immense. You might be sent to a foreign land, far from your family and culture, to marry someone you had never met, whose language you might not speak. Adaptability, resilience, and a strong sense of duty were essential. Your life would be dictated by the needs of your lineage and your kingdom, with individual happiness often a distant second thought. The primary duty of a royal wife, beyond forming alliances, was to produce heirs, particularly male heirs, to secure the succession. Failure to do so could lead to immense pressure, political instability, and in extreme cases, annulment or even accusations of witchcraft. The weight of an entire dynasty rested on your ability to conceive and bear children, a constant source of anxiety in an era of high infant mortality. So, as you envision the complexities of a medieval royal marriage, from the intricate negotiations to the public ceremonies and the immense pressure to produce an heir, you realize that love, as we understand it, was a rare and often irrelevant consideration. It was a life of duty and strategic partnership, where your personal fate was inextricably linked to the political ambitions of your family and your kingdom. You'd certainly appreciate the freedom to choose your own partner after this historical immersion, stepping away from the delicate yet often cold calculations of royal marriage. Your journey through the life of a medieval monarch now leads to perhaps its most volatile and anxiety-ridden aspect: succession and dynastic struggles. Forget peaceful transitions of power. The medieval throne was frequently a bloody prize, constantly coveted and often seized through intrigue, rebellion, or outright war. You'd quickly realize that being a monarch meant living with an ever-present threat to your crown, and perhaps your life. Imagine being a king or queen in an era where the rules of succession were often less clear-cut than a modern primogeniture system, where the eldest son inherits. While hereditary succession was the ideal, it was often challenged. Did the eldest son always have the strongest claim if he was weak or a minor? What about powerful uncles, ambitious cousins, or even strong female claimants? These ambiguities, combined with a warrior culture, often led to brutal power struggle. You'd live with a constant awareness that your relatives could be your most dangerous rivals. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about royal succession, the role of the king's touch, or the belief in divine legitimacy. Many medieval monarchs claimed a divine right to rule, often reinforced by ceremonies like anointing with holy oil. Some even promoted the idea that their touch could cure certain diseases, like scrofula, known as the king's evil. While this belief system aimed to solidify their authority and make them seem untouchable, it also put immense pressure on them to perform miracles, and any perceived weakness could undermine their divine claim, potentially fueling rivals. Imagine having people line up, expecting you to cure their ailments by touch, just to prove you're the rightful ruler. Historians still argue whether the belief in the king's touch was a genuine popular superstition, a cynical tool of royal propaganda, or a complex interplay of faith and political necessity. Beyond direct challenges, the monarch constantly had to manage powerful nobles. Barons and dukes with their own armies and lands could be fickle allies or dangerous enemies. A weak king might find his authority undermined, his commands ignored, and his territory slowly eroded by ambitious vassals. Maintaining a delicate balance of power, granting favors, and delivering justice were crucial to preventing outright rebellion. The political landscape was a constant game of chess, played with real lives and real kingdom. Every decision, every alliance, every marriage was weighed against its potential impact on the stability of the throne. The monarch lived with the knowledge that a powerful noble, a disgruntled relative, or even a foreign power could at any moment raise an army and challenge their right to rule, leading to a brutal struggle for power. So, as you imagine the weight of the crown, not just as a symbol, but as a constant target, you understand that the life of a medieval monarch was often one of profound insecurity and relentless vigilance. The threat of dynastic struggle was a pervasive shadow, making every reign a testament to strength, cunning, and sheer luck in navigating a treacherous political landscape. You'd certainly appreciate the peaceful, if sometimes dull, transitions of modern democracies after witnessing this. Word count 1079. Awaiting, continue. Section 12. Having contemplated the perilous political chess game of succession, your journey through the life of a medieval monarch now shifts to their active role in shaping society. Law, justice, and governance. Forget your complex modern bureaucracies and separation of powers. The medieval monarch was often the supreme legislator, judge, and administrator, personally responsible for maintaining order and dispensing justice across their realm. You'd quickly realize that ruling a kingdom was an incredibly hands-on and often exhausting job. Imagine a king holding court. This wasn't just a social gathering, it was a functioning government. The monarch would be surrounded by their council of trusted nobles, clergy, and advisors. Here, laws would be debated, charters issued, and important decisions made regarding taxation, military campaigns, and foreign policy. The king's word was, in essence, law, though powerful vassals and established customs often placed limits on their absolute power. You'd witness firsthand the immense pressure of making decisions that could affect the lives of thousands, without the benefit of extensive data or expert reports. The monarch was also the ultimate fount of justice. While local courts and feudal lords handled most day-to-day legal disputes, serious crimes, appeals, or cases involving powerful individuals would often come before the king himself. Imagine a long line of petitioners seeking the king's judgment on matters of land, inheritance, or criminal offences. The king or his designated justices would hear pleas, weigh evidence, often based on testimony rather than forensic proof, and deliver verdict. This direct involvement in justice was a powerful symbol of their authority and their role as protector of the realm. A mainstream historical fact is the development of common law in England, largely under the powerful centralizing influence of monarchs like Henry II. This system, based on judicial precedent and uniform application across the kingdom, gradually replaced the patchwork of local customary laws, creating a more cohesive and centralized legal system that still influences legal systems today. This was a monumental task, slowly consolidating royal authority over diverse local jurisdictions. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about medieval justice, trial by ordeal. Before more structured legal processes became widespread, certain cases, particularly those lacking clear evidence, might be decided by ordeal. This involved subjecting the accused to a dangerous physical test, such as holding a hot iron or being submerged in water. If they survived unharmed or floated, they were deemed innocent. Having witnessed the heavy burden of governance and justice, your journey through the life of a medieval monarch now turns to the bedrock of their legitimacy and daily existence, religion and piety. Forget casual church attendance. For medieval royalty, faith was not merely a personal belief, but a pervasive force, deeply interwoven with their power, their politics, and every aspect of their public and private lives. You'd quickly realize that being a king or queen meant being profoundly, overtly, and sometimes inconveniently religious. Imagine the King's Day. It would invariably begin and end with prayer. The royal chapel was a central feature of any castle or palace, and daily mass was often compulsory. Picture the monarch, perhaps kneeling for hours on cold stone, surrounded by courtiers and clergy, participating in elaborate religious ceremonies. Sundays and feast days would involve even longer, more ornate services. This wasn't just about personal devotion. It was a public demonstration of piety, essential for reinforcing the idea that the king's authority came directly from God. The church in the Middle Ages was an incredibly powerful institution, often rivaling secular rulers in wealth and influence. Popes could excommunicate kings, leading to political isolation and even rebellion among their subjects. Bishops and abbots were often powerful landholders and advisors to the crown. Therefore, maintaining a good relationship with the church was not just about saving one's soul, it was a vital political necessity. A mainstream historical fact is the concept of divine right of kings, which gained prominence throughout the medieval period. This doctrine asserted that a monarch's authority was derived directly from God, not from the people or from any earthly power. This belief was often reinforced through elaborate coronation ceremonies, where the monarch was anointed with holy oil by a high-ranking cleric, symbolically making them God's chosen representative on earth. This gave kings immense spiritual authority, but also imposed significant religious obligations. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about royal piety, the collection of holy relics. Many medieval monarchs and wealthy nobles were avid collectors of relics, supposed physical remains of saints or objects associated with holy figures, a splinter of the true cross, a saint's finger bone, etc. These relics were believed to possess miraculous powers and were housed in elaborate reliquaries, becoming prized possessions of the royal treasury. Imagine a king dedicating considerable resources and political maneuvering to acquire a fragment of a saint's garment, believing it would bring divine favor and legitimacy to his reign. It highlights the deeply superstitious, yet devout, nature of medieval faith. Historians still argue whether the collection of relics was primarily a genuine expression of piety, a means of accumulating spiritual and political capital, or simply a reflection of widespread popular superstition. Beyond formal worship, piety permeated daily life. Monarchs would commission illuminated manuscripts for personal prayer, go on pilgrimages to holy sites, often arduous and dangerous journeys, and engage in charitable acts. Giving alms to the poor, founding monasteries, and endowing churches were not just acts of generosity, they were seen as ways to earn salvation and demonstrate kingly virtue. Confession and penance were regular practices, reminding the monarch of their spiritual obligations. Religious symbolism was everywhere, in the art, in the architecture of their castles, and even on their coinage. The cross was a ubiquitous symbol, and biblical narratives informed much of their worldview and moral compass. Even warfare was often justified as a religious crusade, particularly against non-Christian enemies. So, as you observe the constant prayers, the devout rituals, and the deep reverence for the church that shaped every aspect of a medieval monarch's life, you understand that their crown was as much a spiritual burden as a political one. Their legitimacy, their authority, and their very hope for the afterlife were inextricably linked to their perceived piety. You'd certainly appreciate the modern separation of church and state after witnessing this all-encompassing devotion. Having witnessed the profound piety that shaped a medieval monarch's daily life, your journey now turns to a lighter, yet still revealing aspect, entertainment, and pastimes. Forget your streaming services, theme parks, or casual hobbies. Leisure for medieval royalty was limited, often elaborate, and frequently intertwined with their duties, reflecting the values and available technology of the era. You'd quickly realize that simply unwinding wasn't quite as straightforward. Imagine a typical afternoon in a royal court. While periods of intense activity for governance or warfare were common, there were also moments of respite. For many monarchs and their courtiers, hunting was a primary pastime. This wasn't just a sport. It was a highly skilled activity that also provided food for the royal table and served as military training, developing horsemanship and strategic thinking. Picture a royal hunting party riding through vast forests with hounds and falcons, a vibrant and active scene that combined leisure with practical purpose. Falconry, in particular, was a highly refined and aristocratic pursuit. Training and handling these magnificent birds of prey required immense patience and skill, making it a beloved hobby for both kings and queens. Imagine the thrill of seeing a perfectly trained falcon swoop from the sky to bring down its prey. It was a quieter, more aristocratic form of the hunt. A mainstream historical fact is the importance of music and storytelling as forms of royal entertainment. Minstrels, troubadours, and jesters were integral parts of the royal household, providing constant entertainment. They would perform ballads, epic poems, juggling acts, and comedic routines, often reflecting current events or historical tales. These performances were not just for amusement. They also served to disseminate news, preserve oral traditions, and subtly flatter the monarch. Without mass media, live performance was king. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about medieval royal entertainment, the popularity of chess. While outdoor activities like hunting were prominent, indoor pastimes were also crucial, especially during long winter evenings or periods of illness. Chess, introduced to Europe from the Middle East, became incredibly popular among the nobility and royalty. It wasn't just a game. It was seen as a strategic exercise, training the mind for warfare and governance. Imagine the king, deep in thought, over a chessboard, planning his next move, perhaps even with a large, ornate, hand-carved set. It offered a quiet, intellectual escape from the pressures of court life. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of chess was primarily due to its intellectual challenge, its strategic training benefits, or simply its exotic appeal as a game from foreign land. Reading, for those who were literate, was another cherished pastime. Though books were rare and expensive, often beautifully illuminated manuscripts, gambling, playing dice, and various board games were also popular, offering a chance for social interaction and light-hearted competition. For the ladies of the court, embroidery, tapestry weaving, and other forms of needlework were common, combining artistic expression with practical skill. Feasts, as we've explored, were also major forms of entertainment, often featuring elaborate subtleties and performances. Public spectacles such as tournaments, which served as both training and entertainment, as you'll recall, and religious festivals also offered opportunities for both entertainment and public display of royal presence. However, boredom could still be a real issue. With limited options compared to your modern world, periods of inactivity or travel could lead to a slow kind of tedium. There was no instant gratification, no endless scrolling. Leisure was often communal, structured, and tied to the physical environment and social expectations. So, as you watch a royal hunting party gallop across the fields, or a king quietly contemplating a chessboard, you understand that medieval royal entertainment was both simpler and more profound than your own. It was a reflection of a world where leisure was earned through duty, and every pastime, even games, could serve a higher purpose of training or status. You'd likely appreciate the sheer variety of entertainment available to you today after experiencing this more limited menu of amusement. After journeying through the many facets of a medieval monarch's demanding life, from their precarious birth to their strategic marriages and their moments of structured leisure, your final stop brings you to the inevitable conclusion of all mortal reigns: death, burial, and legacy. Forget quiet, private funerals. For medieval royalty, death was often a public spectacle, and their burial was a meticulously orchestrated affair designed to reinforce their power even beyond the grave, shaping their legacy for centuries to come. You'd quickly realize that a king's passing was as much a political event as it was a personal tragedy. Imagine the monarch's final moments. Even in death, a royal person was rarely alone. Attendants, clergy, and trusted advisors would surround the deathbed, documenting the last words, witnessing the transfer of power, and ensuring the proper spiritual rites were performed. The body itself would undergo elaborate preparations. It might be embalmed, often a crude process involving spices and wine, or even dismembered and buried in separate locations, heart in one church, bowels in another, and the main body in a royal tomb. A quirky practice sometimes done for symbolic or practical reasons. End of script. Sweet dream. The period immediately following a royal death was one of intense political activity. A council would typically be formed to oversee the transition of power, and the new monarch would quickly move to secure their position, often issuing charters and making promises to key nobles to ensure loyalty. The funeral was a crucial part of this transition, a public display of mourning that simultaneously affirmed the legitimacy of the successor. A mainstream historical fact is the importance of elaborate funeral processions and effigies. For deceased monarchs, a grand procession would often carry the body, or a lifelike effigy, a wax or wooden likeness of the deceased, through the streets to the burial site. This allowed the populace to pay their respects and visually confirm the monarch's passing, while the effigy symbolically represented the continued presence of royal authority even after death. These were massive public events involving hundreds of mourners, clergy, and military escorts. Now, for a rather quirky tidbit about royal burials, the practice of heart burial. As mentioned, some medieval monarchs and high-ranking nobles specifically requested that their hearts be removed and buried separately from their bodies, often in a beloved monastery, a particularly significant church, or even a site associated with a crusade. Imagine having your most vital organ laid to rest hundreds of miles from your main tomb. It was seen as a profound act of piety, a way to ensure spiritual intercession, or a powerful symbolic connection to a specific place. Historians still argue whether heart burial was primarily a spiritual act of devotion, a practical solution for far-flung deaths, or a means of distributing royal prestige among various religious sites. The burial itself would be in a prominent location, often a grand abbey or cathedral like Westminster Abbey or St. Denis, in an elaborate tomb. These tombs were not just burial markers, they were powerful pieces of political propaganda, depicting the monarch in regal splendor, often with symbols of their reign designed to remind future generations of their greatness and to solidify their place in history. Pilgrimages to royal tombs were common, adding to their sacred and historical significance. The monarch's legacy was, therefore, not left to chance. Chroniclers would carefully record their deeds, often with a biased slant to ensure a favorable historical portrayal. Monuments, endowments, and the continuation of dynastic policies all contributed to shaping how they would be remembered. The goal was to secure a place in history, to be seen as a just ruler, a valiant warrior, and a pious servant of God, ensuring the stability and prestige of the lineage for centuries to come. So, as you reflect on the ultimate end of a medieval royal life, from the solemn deathbed to the magnificent tomb, you understand that even in death, a monarch remained profoundly connected to their kingdom and their legacy. Their passing was a culmination of their reign, a final act in the grand drama of medieval power and purpose. And as the distant echoes of trumpets and lamentations fade, you're left with a sense of the enduring weight of history, and perhaps a quiet appreciation for the simplicity of modern farewells.